Have you ever felt suddenly overwhelmed by shame, panic, or hopelessness, seemingly out of nowhere, and had no idea why? Or maybe you've spent years wondering why relationships feel so hard, why your inner voice is so ruthlessly critical, why you feel stuck no matter how much you try to move forward. If any of that sounds familiar, this book may be one of the most important things you ever encounter. Today we're summarizing Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker, a therapist and a survivor himself. This is not a book about war veterans or dramatic disasters. It's about the quiet, chronic trauma of growing up in a home where you were never truly safe, never truly seen, and never truly loved the way a child deserves to be. Let's get into it. Most people have heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, typically associated with soldiers returning from combat or survivors of catastrophic events. But Pete Walker introduces us to a different, and in many ways more hidden, form of trauma: complex PTSD, or CPTSD. CPTSD is not caused by a single terrible event. It develops from prolonged, repeated trauma, usually in childhood, most commonly in the form of ongoing abuse, neglect, or abandonment by the people who were supposed to protect you. Here's the first piece of genuinely good news Walker offers. CPTSD is not genetic. It is not something hardwired into your brain or your DNA. It is learned, a set of responses and coping strategies that your young mind developed to survive a dangerous environment. And because it is learned, it can be unlearned. Walker identifies 5 core features that distinguish CPTSD from regular PTSD: emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, a vicious inner critic, and social anxiety. Each of these becomes its own chapter in the recovery process. And understanding each one is the beginning of real healing. So how exactly does CPTSD develop in a child? Walker explains that it begins with what he calls abandonment, not just physical abandonment, but emotional abandonment. When a parent meets a child's natural need for comfort, connection, and safety with contempt, rage, or indifference, the child learns something devastating: I am not worthy of love. Contempt, Walker says, is like a toxic cocktail of rage and disgust. When a parent looks at a crying child with disdain instead of warmth, or worse, punishes them for needing attention, the child learns to stop asking. They stop reaching out. They start shutting down. And here is something crucial. Emotional neglect alone, even without any hitting, can cause CPTSD. Many survivors discount their own suffering because they were never physically struck. But Walker is clear. Growing up without emotional warmth, interest, or protection is profoundly traumatizing. He compares it to nearly dying of thirst outside a locked fountain. The child starves for human connection and receives none. Over time, this experience of repeated abandonment and danger programs the child's nervous system into a state of constant alert. The fight or flight response never fully turns off. And this is where CPTSD truly takes hold. One of Pete Walker's most significant contributions to the field of trauma is his concept of the emotional flashback. Unlike the flashbacks of traditional PTSD, which often involve reliving a specific scene, emotional flashbacks have no visual component. You don't see anything. Instead, you are suddenly flooded by the overwhelming feelings of your childhood: intense fear, crushing shame, deep grief, helpless rage, or a deadened sense of hopelessness. And the terrible thing is, you often don't know why. You might be in the middle of a normal day, and out of nowhere you feel small, worthless, terrified, or frozen. These aren't random emotional malfunctions. They are regressions. Your nervous system is flashing back to how it felt to be that abandoned child. Walker notes that emotional flashbacks can range from subtle to completely overwhelming. They can last minutes or drag on for days or weeks. And because they look nothing like the dramatic flashback scenes people see in movies, survivors are often told they have bipolar disorder, borderline personality, ADHD, or depression, when the real underlying cause is unresolved childhood trauma. Naming the experience as a flashback, just that simple act of recognition, can bring immediate relief. At the center of every emotional flashback is something Walker calls toxic shame. Unlike healthy guilt, which says, "I did something wrong." Toxic shame says something far more devastating. "I am wrong. I am defective. I am unlovable. I am disgusting." This shame is not something you were born with. It was installed in you by contemptuous, neglectful, or abusive caregivers. When a parent repeatedly meets you with disgust, dismissal, or rage, the child's developing brain draws the only conclusion it can: there must be something deeply wrong with me. Walker shares a heartbreaking example of a handsome, intelligent client who genuinely believed he was ugly because his entire childhood had been drenched in his father's contempt and his family's ridicule. The shame had become so internalized that it overrode objective reality entirely. Toxic shame blocks survivors from seeking comfort, from believing they deserve support, and from forming authentic connections. Recovery requires compassionately dismantling this shame and reassigning the blame where it truly belongs, to the adults who failed in their duty to love and protect. Now, not everyone responds to childhood trauma in the same way. Walker introduces a brilliantly useful framework he calls the 4 F's: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The fight type responds to danger with anger and control. As children, they may have learned to survive by fighting back or by imitating a dominating parent. As adults, they can come across as controlling, critical, or narcissistic, using contempt as armor against the vulnerability of abandonment. The flight type escapes inner pain through constant doing. They become workaholics, perfectionists, overachievers, always rushing, always producing, always one step ahead of the fear and emptiness underneath. ADHD-like hyperactivity or obsessive-compulsive tendencies are common in this group. The freeze type responds to danger by going numb and withdrawing. They disconnect from the world, dissociate, hide in their rooms, and often struggle to engage with life at all. Freeze types can look like they simply lack motivation, but in reality, they checked out because engaging felt too dangerous. And the fawn type survives by making themselves agreeable. They learned early that the only way to stay safe was to anticipate and serve others' needs, suppress their own, and never, ever cause conflict. Fawn types often grow into adults who don't know what they feel, what they want, or even who they are. Most survivors lean heavily toward one or two of these types. Recognizing yours is one of the most empowering steps in recovery. Of all the internal wounds CPTSD creates, perhaps the most relentlessly damaging is the inner critic. Walker explains that the inner critic begins as an internalization of abusive or neglectful parents. The child, desperate to win approval and figure out how to be safe, starts repeating the criticisms they received, and eventually, those voices become their own. "I'm so stupid. I'm such a loser. I can't do anything right. Why would anyone want me?" Over time, this inner critic stops sounding like a parent and starts sounding like the absolute truth about who you are. And it doesn't just whisper. Walker describes it as a tyrannical force that can trigger devastating emotional flashbacks all on its own. He identifies 14 specific types of inner critic attacks, including perfectionism, catastrophizing, toxic shame, all-or-none thinking, excessive guilt, worrying, and harsh self-judgment. The antidote to each attack is conscious, repeated thought-stopping and thought correction, actively challenging the critic with counterstatements of self-compassion and reality. Recovery isn't about silencing the critic overnight. It is about gradually disidentifying from it, learning to see it as a conditioned response, not the truth, and choosing a different, kinder inner voice instead. Walker provides one of the most practical tools in the entire book: 13 steps for managing emotional flashbacks. Let's walk through the essential ones. Step 1 is simply to recognize that you are in a flashback. Say it to yourself: "I am having a flashback." This one act of naming can begin to create distance between you and the overwhelming emotions. Step 2 is to remind yourself of the present reality. I am an adult now. I am safe. My parents are not here. The feelings are real, but the danger they are pointing to is in the past. Step 3 is to breathe deeply and slowly, and bring your attention back into your body. Grounding yourself in physical sensation interrupts the spiral of the flashback. Step 4 is to challenge the inner critic. The critic is almost always active during a flashback, flooding you with self-attacks. Firmly say no to it. Refuse its narrative. Step 9, and this is one of the most powerful, is to grieve. Emotional flashbacks are often trapped childhood pain looking for a way out. When you allow yourself to cry, to express anger, to verbally ventilate your pain with a safe person or in writing, the flashback frequently resolves. Grieving is not weakness. For CPTSD survivors, it is medicine. Underneath all the fear, all the shame, and all the critic's noise, there is a deeper layer Walker calls the abandonment depression. This is the deadened, hopeless, helpless feeling that sets in when a child has been abandoned so completely that they give up on seeking help, on expecting warmth, on the possibility of being loved. It is not sadness exactly. It is closer to a kind of emotional death. In flashbacks, survivors often cycle through a painful sequence. Fear and panic give way to toxic shame, which then collapses into this gray, heavy despair. Walker calls this the abandonment melange, a swirling mixture of shame, fear, and depression that feels inescapable. Understanding this cycle is profoundly helpful. When you recognize the depression as a flashback to your childhood reality rather than the truth of your present life, it shifts something. You stop pathologizing yourself. You start grieving what you lost. Many readers arrive at this book believing their childhood wasn't bad enough to explain their suffering. Maybe they weren't beaten. Maybe things looked normal from the outside. Walker dedicates an entire chapter to this. What if I was never hit? He is unequivocal. Emotional neglect, the absence of parental warmth, interest, empathy, and protection, is one of the most damaging things that can happen to a child. And it is almost always the hardest to see, because there's no bruise, no incident to point to. When a parent consistently turns their back on a child's need for connection, that child's inner world becomes a frightening place. They feel worthless, unlovable, and deeply empty. The world feels dangerous. Other people feel dangerous. And yet they often blame themselves, because blaming the parents who failed them feels too threatening to contemplate. Deminimizing your own experience, truly acknowledging that what happened to you was not okay, was not your fault, and did cause real harm, is one of the most liberating acts in recovery. Walker returns to grieving again and again throughout the book, because he believes it is the single most powerful healing tool available to CPTSD survivors. But this isn't wallowing. Healthy grieving, as Walker describes it, is an active process. It includes crying, which releases fear. It includes expressing anger, which is the healthy response to the injustice of what was done to you. And it includes verbal ventilation, speaking or writing your pain, ideally with someone safe who can receive it without judgment. What makes grieving so powerful is that it allows you to metabolize the old childhood pain rather than carrying it forward indefinitely. Every time you grieve a layer of what you lost, the mother who was never warm, the father who never saw you, the childhood that was never safe, you release a piece of the weight you've been carrying. And remarkably, healthy grieving is often the fastest way out of an emotional flashback. When the pain finds expression instead of suppression, the flashback resolves. If the inner critic attacks you, the outer critic attacks everyone else. It is hypervigilance turned outward, constantly scanning others for signs of danger, rejection, or betrayal. The outer critic is why CPTSD survivors often struggle so deeply in relationships. Safe people can feel dangerous. Love can feel like a trap. Intimacy triggers flashbacks to the very childhood moments when closeness was followed by humiliation or abandonment. Each of the 4 F types manages this differently. Fight types drive others away with anger and demands. Flight types stay too busy to get close. Freeze types retreat into isolation. Fawn types disappear into service, never revealing their true selves. The recovery work here involves very gradually and very carefully learning to trust again. Not blindly, not instantly, but step by step, as safe people demonstrate over time that they can be counted on. Because fawn types are so common and so often overlooked, Walker gives them special attention. Fawning, The learned pattern of making yourself small, agreeable, and endlessly helpful to avoid conflict or rejection looks like kindness from the outside. But on the inside, it is self-erasure. FAWN types often have almost no sense of who they are. Their identity has been built entirely around other people's needs and moods. They have learned that the cost of having their own wants, opinions, or limits is rejection, and rejection feels life-threatening. Recovery for FAWN types involves the painstaking, courageous work of finding a self, discovering what you actually feel, what you actually want, and learning to voice those things even at the risk of disapproval. It also involves recognizing and setting limits, not to be difficult, but because appropriate self-protection is a basic human right. A profound theme running through the entire book is that recovery requires becoming, in a sense, the parent you never had. Walker calls this self-reparenting, developing the ability to give yourself, through your own inner voice and actions, what your parents failed to provide. Warmth, compassion, encouragement, protection from abusive internal voices, patience with your own imperfections. This is not a fast process. It requires consistent practice over a long period of time. But slowly, the harsh voice of the critic can be replaced, not by toxic positivity, but by a genuine, steady, earned self-regard. The kind that says, "I deserved better then, and I will treat myself better now." Walker is careful to emphasize that recovery is not just a solo journey. Healing happens in relationship. This might be with a therapist. It might be with a trusted friend, a partner, a support group, or even through the pages of books written by people who understand. Walker calls this reparenting by committee, drawing on multiple sources of genuine human warmth and understanding to fill in what was missing in childhood. For survivors who were so thoroughly betrayed that trusting anyone feels impossible, healing might begin with pets, with nature, or with online communities of fellow survivors. The path matters less than the direction, moving, however slowly, toward connection rather than away from it. So what does recovery actually look like? Walker is honest. It is not a straight line. But the markers of genuine progress are real and recognizable. Flashbacks become less frequent, less intense, and shorter in duration. The inner critic loses some of its power, not because it disappears, but because you get better at identifying it and refusing to believe it. Self-esteem grows, tentatively at first, then with more solidity. You begin to feel your own worth. Relationships start to feel possible. The hypervigilance softens. You stop needing to earn your right to exist in every interaction. You start to feel, maybe for the first time, that you are genuinely on your own side. Progress includes setbacks. There will be hard days, hard seasons, moments when you feel like you're back at square one. But with the tools Walker provides, you learn that a flashback is not a relapse. It is a signal, and you now know how to respond to it. Complex PTSD is not a life sentence. That is Pete Walker's core message, and it comes from someone who has lived it, worked through it, and spent a career helping others do the same. The tools are here. Understand your flashbacks, challenge your inner critic, grieve your losses, identify your 4F type, reparent yourself with compassion, and open, slowly, carefully, to safe human connection. You did not choose what happened to you in childhood. You adapted to survive in the best way you could. But surviving is not the same as living, and you deserve more than survival. The journey from surviving to thriving is possible. It is not easy, but it is real. And it begins with the single act of choosing to take your own side. If this summary resonated with you, we highly recommend reading Pete Walker's full book. And if you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Take good care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next summary.